What if one of Hollywood's most beloved icons had spent his entire life hiding a truth so devastating, it was only whispered into a tape recorder on his deathbed? In the summer of 2008, as Paul Newman lay dying in his Connecticut home, he didn't reflect on Oscars or red carpets. Instead, he asked for a Panasonic tape recorder, day after day, placing it beside his pillow like a final witness. What poured out wasn't a memoir, but a confession. Not of crime, but of love. 6 hidden romances with some of the most famous men in Hollywood. What he revealed wasn't romantic fantasy, it was emotional warfare, betrayal, manipulation, blackmail. One lover sold his letters to the press. Another recorded their private conversations, using them as weapons. The world had always seen Paul as the blueprint of grace and loyalty. But behind the scenes, he had spent decades protecting reputations that would one day destroy him. And in his final recordings, he made one thing clear. If I don't speak now, I'll vanish in silence. The emotional weight of his secrets begins in 1961 at a fundraiser at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Newman arrived with his wife Joanne Woodward, ever composed. Marlon Brando entered late, unbuttoned, disheveled, and disarming. That first night, Brando whispered, "I thought you'd be boring. Turns out you're the only one not pretending." It was the beginning of a love that would quickly dissolve into manipulation. While Paul loved deeply, Brando loved strategically. He paraded Paul through secret gatherings and whispered promises, only to orchestrate media spectacles behind his back. The deepest cut came when Brando leaked Paul's handwritten letters, raw and trusting, to a tabloid journalist. The resulting article veiled Paul in anonymity, but Joanne knew. She found a letter tucked in a book and left him a note that read, "If you need shelter, I'm still here. But if you need one more lie, I'm not the person who can help you." But the story doesn't end with Brando. In 1969, while filming Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul found something equally electric with Robert Redford. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable. Off-screen, glances lingered too long. Conversations drifted too deep. Behind the scenes, a quiet, profound romance unfolded, one Paul hoped would someday exist in daylight. But Redford was cautious, calculated. The love they shared remained unspoken, cloaked in silence. In 1976, Paul scheduled an interview to finally reveal the truth, only to be warned hours before. "If you say one word, you'll lose everything." That night, the journalist received an anonymous fax, smearing Paul with claims of substance abuse and emotional instability. The interview was canceled. Soon after, his career slowed without explanation. When asked at the 1980 BAFTAs if he still spoke to Paul, Redford answered coldly, "We made something great together, but everyone has to move on." Paul later wrote in his journal, "The man who once called me his light now uses me as his shadow." For a man who loved in silence, being erased was the ultimate cruelty. Yet the most dangerous love of all was still to come. Paul met Steve McQueen in 1956, backstage at the Photoplay Awards. McQueen was young, cocky, and magnetic. Their connection was instant, but volatile. Their meetings turned from passion to paranoia. Steve demanded control, forcing Paul to sign NDAs, threatening him with silence, and even bribing editors to kill stories. Paul once discovered a $15,000 payment McQueen made to a tabloid to bury any connection between them. The worst betrayal came during a live TV appearance. When asked about rumors of an obsessed fan, McQueen smirked and said, "Just some creepy guy who sends love letters and knocks on my door." Paul watched in agony as his heartbreak became punchline. It got worse. Steve had secretly recorded every call, every confession, every kiss. He stored them like loaded bullets. During a heated confrontation on the set of The Towering Inferno, Paul screamed, "Why did you turn me into a madman in the eyes of the world?" McQueen opened a drawer and tossed him a cassette. "Just a precaution," he sneered. "You talk, I respond." This wasn't just heartbreak, it was annihilation. Through every relationship, Brando's betrayal, Redford's silence, McQueen's coercion, Paul was pulled deeper into isolation. Each love took a piece of him, each silence weighed heavier. Yet through it all, Joanne remained. Sometimes in another room, sometimes across the country, but never fully gone. She didn't fight him, she didn't shame him, she simply left him space. Her notes were few, but they said everything. "So this is why you haven't slept for 2 years. If you choose lies, don't drag me down with you. She endured it all, not because she was blind, but because she understood that sometimes love is less about purity and more about compassion in the face of unbearable truth. Hollywood never allowed Paul to live his truth. The same system that made him a legend forced him into a lifelong performance. Studios erased evidence, publicists spun rumors, tabloids printed fiction and called it news. And through it all, Paul suffered in silence, framed as troubled, temperamental, or emotionally erratic, never for what he truly was. A man broken by love, trapped by fame, and betrayed by the very people he trusted most. At the end, Paul didn't want pity. His tapes weren't a cry for help, they were a plea for memory. "I don't tell this story to be forgiven," he said. "I tell it so that I won't be forgotten." And maybe that's what these revelations are. More than scandal, more than whispers. They are the last remaining pieces of a man who spent his life hiding from the light, and finally, as his own began to fade, chose to shine the truth. One confession at a time. What if the love stories you were never meant to hear were the ones that defined a legend? What if the most devastating chapters of Paul Newman's life were buried not in Hollywood archives, but in secret recordings made on his deathbed? Confessions of love, betrayal, and loss that never made it to the screen? In the shadows of his fame, behind every red carpet smile and polished performance, Newman lived a double life, one defined not by roles, but by secrets he carried alone. This is the part of his story no studio dared to tell. And once you hear it, you'll never see him the same way again. By the time Steve McQueen married Ally McGraw in 1973, Paul Newman said nothing publicly. But a week later, Steve received a package, unmarked, ominous. Inside was a torn shirt, blood-stained and smudged with lipstick, worn during a drunken night at Paul's Vermont cabin. It wasn't nostalgia, it was a warning. Yet even then, Paul couldn't let go. In a trembling whisper on one of his final tapes, he admitted, "He used love like a knife, and still, I came back. Still, I loved him." But before McQueen, there was James Dean. It was 1955 when Paul met the rising star on a Warner Brothers lot. Paul was 30, James just 24. What began as admiration quickly became something far deeper. Quiet drives, handwritten notes, and late-night conversations in roadside diners and cabins. Newman later called it the most gentle love he ever experienced. Then, everything changed. A paparazzo caught them kissing inside a parked car off Sunset Strip. The photo never made it to print, but the fallout was immediate. Paul lost roles, James lost contracts, and behind closed doors, Dean began to spiral. After a near-fatal overdose, he sent Paul a note. "Mexico City, Friday. If you don't come, I'll understand." Paul bought a ticket, made it to the airport, then turned back. 3 days later, James Dean died in a car crash. Paul never forgave himself. In a tape recorded decades later, he whispered, "Why didn't I get on that plane? If I had, would he still be alive?" That guilt never left. By the early 1970s, the world still saw Paul as a golden figure. Oscar winner, devoted husband, Hollywood's moral compass. But inside, he was unraveling. Years of betrayal, of loving in silence, of being loved only in the dark had worn him thin. Joanne Woodward, his wife, saw what the world missed. One day, without confrontation, she quietly handed him the name of a discreet therapist and said, "I think you need somewhere to breathe." It was in that quiet office where Paul met Sal Mineo, a once rising star dubbed the second James Dean, exiled by Hollywood for being too sensitive, too fragile, too real. "You're in treatment too?" Paul asked. Sal tapped his temple and replied, "Not to cure an illness, just what they told me was one." That moment became the start of something rare. Their relationship wasn't fiery or forbidden, it was peaceful. Walks after therapy, notes slipped into pockets. A kind of healing love Paul had never known. "When I was with Sal," he later said, "I forgot I was Paul Newman. I was just me." They planned a trip to Venice in 1976. Sal had written a screenplay, two men in a city slowly drowning, clinging to each other. But the trip never happened. On February 12th, Sal was stabbed to death outside his West Hollywood apartment. The police called it a robbery. Paul didn't believe it for a second. He sat in silence for 3 days, then recorded a tape. "He never needed anything from me, except for me to dare to be myself. And I never got the chance to say thank you." But perhaps the deepest wound came from Montgomery Clift. Their bond was quiet, unspoken, woven through letters never meant to be read. But Joanne eventually found them in 1966, tucked under Paul's pillow. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply held out a letter and said, "So this is why you haven't slept for 2 years." What followed was a cascade. One letter leaked, tabloids exploded, studios threatened lawsuits, and Joanne left. Monty, drained and heartbroken, cut off all contact. A month later, Paul got the call. Monty had tried to end his life. He survived, but never spoke to Paul again. The collapse was total. Paul checked himself into a psychiatric facility under a false name. His diagnosis: severe emotional trauma, nervous exhaustion, and self-denial. He paid to keep it hidden. But even years later, the ache remained, an unhealed scar from a love he never had the courage to protect. Through it all, Joanne remained an unspoken pillar. She was never just the wife. She was his mirror, his moral compass, and his quiet witness. Over the years, she found more than one letter not meant for her. Sometimes in drawers, sometimes beneath scripts, always folded carefully as if hiding them made them less real. She never reacted with rage. No screaming, no slamming doors, just notes, devastating in their calmness. "If you need shelter, I'm still here." And later, "If you need one more lie, I'm not." The world saw Paul Newman as an icon of virtue. But behind the flawless exterior lived a man fractured by love, bound by silence, and haunted by the moments he didn't act. His recordings weren't made to clear his name. They were made so he wouldn't vanish. "I don't tell this story to be forgiven," he said. "I tell it so that I won't be forgotten." What if the greatest love story in Hollywood was one the world was never meant to hear? What if the woman known as Paul Newman's devoted wife was not just a bystander to his legacy, but the silent guardian of his hidden truth? In the shadows of his fame, behind the magazine covers and glowing interviews, lay a heartbreak so profound it was only ever whispered into a tape recorder. Until now. Joanne Woodward was no stranger to heartbreak, but hers came without scandal, without spectacle. When she found one of Paul's love letters from Montgomery Clift, she didn't shout. She didn't break things. She looked at him, quiet and calm, and said, "So this is why you haven't slept for 2 years," then picked up her suitcase and walked away. But she never slammed the door. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She understood that sometimes love isn't about being chosen. It's about choosing to stay, even when the world gives you every reason to leave. She stayed through Brando's betrayal, through Redford's denial, through Steve McQueen's blackmail, through the brutal loss of Sal Mineo. Sometimes she was in the room beside him, sometimes across the country. But she was never truly gone. And she never spoke about what she knew. Hollywood never gave her credit for that kind of strength. Just like it never gave Paul the freedom to be whole. The very machine that elevated him to icon status demanded he slice away the parts of himself that didn't fit the mold. A world obsessed with curated masculinity had no space for contradiction, no patience for complexity. When whispers began, of unusual friendships, of emotional breakdowns, studio handlers stepped in. Stories were rewritten, photos were buried, publicists leaked alternative narratives. And Paul? He was labeled difficult, troubled, moody, never heartbroken, never haunted. But the truth was never erased. It was simply delayed. In the summer of 2008, knowing death was near, Paul Newman began recording his truth. Not for scandal, not for revenge. He recorded to be remembered as more than a movie star, more than a husband, more than a myth. "I spent a lifetime waiting for someone to love me out loud," he murmured into the tape, his voice almost gone. But when they finally did, it was too late. "I was already trained to disappear." Here, the story reaches its most devastating peak, not in a grand betrayal, but in a lifetime of quiet erasure. Paul didn't rage against the world. He simply faded within it, piece by piece, performance by performance. Joanne, the woman who knew everything, who found letters not meant for her and stayed anyway, bore witness to it all. Their marriage wasn't perfect. It was fractured, weathered, full of unspoken truths. But it was also graceful in its own painful way. She didn't save him from his sorrow. She stood beside him while it tried to destroy him. And now, as we listen to the fragments he left behind, the confessions, the heartbreaks, the impossible love stories, we're forced to ask ourselves, what is truth? What is memory? And how long can a person endure silence before it becomes their legacy? Paul Newman didn't ask to be forgiven. He asked not to be forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, hearing his voice now, we're finally giving him what he was always denied: the freedom to be seen.